Welcome back, everybody. Jacob Seek here with Certified Photo Training. We are going to be doing another exposure lesson on Aperture today. We're stuck indoors, just like everybody else is. That is why I put together this 5 pandemic-proof portrait tip guide that you can use during the pandemic here to make sure you're doing it safely. So if you want to go to the website, www.certifiedphototraining.com, go ahead and download this resource right here. And then we're going to go ahead and be talking about Aperture today. Now I'm going to try to keep this relatively short because there's a lot to talk about with Aperture. So I've actually got a list of notes here that I'm going to be using to talk about Aperture. I'm going to be breaking down my camera a little bit. I'm breaking down my camera a little bit to show you what Aperture means, different apertures to be using for certain situations, and what it really means in general to what Aperture actually means in its full definition. And then I'm going to try to clear up some of the confusion that people have with the Aperture numbers. Okay, so this is a big one because I know a lot of people struggle because it's, like I was saying yesterday, everything in photography is counterintuitive. So it is to be expected that the numbers within Aperture is going to confuse you. Okay, so let's try to clear that up today. So let's go ahead, flip over to our window here. Now, yesterday we talked about ISO. So we talked about ISO along the bottom. So I will be referring to ISO with today's lesson, but I will be looking along the left-hand side where it says Aperture. So we'll be looking along that left-hand side here, as you see right along there, along here. This is what we're going to be looking at today. So first things first, what does Aperture mean? Well, let me see if I can readjust this a little bit. So what does Aperture actually mean? So Aperture is an opening, hole, or gap. Now in photography, that pertains to your lens, okay? Your aperture is within your lens. But with Aperture, all kinds of other professions use apertures. Like for instance, let's say a plumber will choose a different aperture opening of the PVC pipe that they're using. So Aperture is used in all kinds of different professions. But within photography, it's used to control the amount of light that is coming into your camera. So, with that being said, let's break down how you can easily understand Aperture in just a matter of seconds. Okay, so I want everybody to make this analogy. Okay, I want you to make this analogy. I want you to make the analogy of the aperture of your lens is the exact same. Is used for the exact same reason and purpose as the pupil of your eyeball, okay? So your aperture of your lens is the exact same as the pupil of your eyeball. So what does that mean? What it does is controls the amount of light that's coming into your camera, and the same thing like the pupil of your eye is it controls the amount of light that's coming into your eyeball for your brain to process and comprehend. Okay, so making that analogy right up front there, all right, for everybody, that the aperture is the pupil of your eye. That's the best way to understand it, okay? So when we talk about the different numbers within the aperture scale, we have to look at it as how wide is it open, okay? So I want you to envision this. So you want to relate the pupil of your eye to your aperture, okay? So that's exactly what the aperture of your camera is the pupil of your eye. So when your aperture is really dilated, open, when it's really wide open like you see on my screen here, down at the bottom left-hand scale where it says brighter, where it says 1.4, that's your pupil of your eye is really wide open, so it allows more light into your lens, okay? So the wider that your lens is, the more light gathering ability that it has, okay? So going to the other end of the scale, if you look at the other end of the scale here at f16, now that's a really constricted pupil. That would be relatable to when you walk outside in direct sunlight and you look at something really bright. What does your pupils do when you look at something really bright? They're going to constrict because it's so bright, it's trying to let in less light, which is why it's on the darker end of the scale, okay? So the smaller your pupil, the less light that you're allowing in. The wider your pupil, the more light you're allowing in. Now, a good way to think about this one is, imagine that you are sleeping at night, you've been sleeping all night, you wake up in the middle of the night to get a middle of the night snack or something like that. Okay, so you're up at 1 a.m., you've been sleeping for hours, you wake up in the middle of the night, and what are your pupils like? Are they constricted or are they wide open? Well, they're wide open. And why are they wide open? So you can gather more light, okay? So that you can see in the dark. You see what I'm saying? So open up your aperture means you're allowing in more light. So think about waking up in the middle of the night. Now compare waking up in the middle of the night to walking out on a direct sunlight day like today, okay? If you walk in from indoors even, your aperture of your pupil is pretty wide, because indoors there's actually not a lot of light. But here's the thing to understand, everybody, is our pupils dilate and constrict automatically. We have to control it manually with our cameras, okay? And so that's what aperture is all about. So it's important to understand that, like, even though you're indoors and you can see just fine, that's because your pupils have already dilated automatically. But when you do this with photography, you need to dial your aperture to a wider aperture in order to gather more light indoors, because there's less light indoors than there is, say, in direct sunlight outside or even in the shade. But what I want to talk about next is the confusion over the numbers, okay? So the f-stop scale, I'm not going to go too far into why they are the way that they are. You will notice that they double every other. Now again, the f-stop numbers are broken up just like ISO. Every time you go to the next f-stop number on this scale is +1 or -1, depending which way you're going. Now pay attention to where it says brighter. Remember we talked about the opening of your eye, okay? The opening of your pupil. Well, let's say you're waking up in the middle of the night. Your pupil's at like 1.4 there, okay? You're waking up, you got pretty much night vision, okay? So you got the best night vision you're gonna have as a human being, all right? That's you at 1.4, and then say you go open up the fridge and you stare at the fridge light, and now your pupil just automatically constricted down to like F8 or F11 to allow less light in, to adjust for that brightening of that light source. So you have to be thinking about aperture that way. So with that said, when you're at 1.4, you're really wide open. You're allowing in a lot of light, and a lot of lenses won't allow in that much light. Okay, so that's what they talk about with fast lenses, and we'll see if we have time for that. I know aperture, I can go on and on and on and on and on. Okay, so f-stop scale. So you'll notice every 2 stops, it actually doubles in the numbers. So 2.8 and 2 stops is 5.6. I want everybody to ignore that for now, because that has to do with dividing it by its root of 2, which we're not going to talk about right now, because we're talking about focal lengths. We're just talking about what aperture is today. So aperture, again, is an opening, gap, or a hole, and in photography, it's the blades that control the pupil of the eye or the pupil of your lens. Now, let me show you that, okay? So, if you look at my lens here, okay, that's at like 22 right there. Yep, 22. So that's like if it's a direct sunlight, okay? If you're looking at like a really bright light source or something like that. Now, let's say you wake up in the middle of the night, your pupil does this, okay? I'm trying to get it angled just right so that everybody can see it right. Okay, so this is 22 or 16. Look at that scale and look at 16. And then this is 1.8, okay? So this is allowing in way more light because it's a wider pupil, okay? This is a more constricted pupil or a constricted aperture, so it's allowing in less light, okay? Simple as that, okay? So a big opening is, think about like water going through a pipe, okay? Like if this was a pipe that was this wide, there's going to be more water that flows through it. If the pipe is this constricted, there's going to be less water that flows through it. Same thing with light, okay? So it's the same idea. Now the elements of glass inside your lens, now that is what focuses the light. So the light has to be brought in, but it also has to be focused, and that's what's inside of your lens, okay? Compare the lens of your camera to your eyeball in general, to be completely honest with you. That's what it is, okay? So let's move on from there. So like I said, it's counterintuitive. Look at that scale. The lower the f-stop number, the brighter the image. The bigger the f-stop number, the darker the image. So it is counterintuitive in that way, that you would think the higher the number, the brighter the image. No, it's the other way around, okay? And there's reasons for that, but we're just gonna, we're taking aperture slowly here so everybody can kind of get on the same page. With that said, if you're just logging on now, go to our website and download this 5 pandemic proof portrait tip that I just put together for everybody. This is perfect for everybody who's stuck indoors right now. So, and then, yeah, you can go to our website there at the bottom of the page there, certifiedphototraining.com. With Aperture, it seems to be one of the things that trips people up the most, but honestly, it's so easy to understand when you think about it in terms of being the pupil of your eye. Now, when it comes down to, let's see, where am I at the scale? Okay. So when you're doing portraits, you've seen it all the time. You've seen those portraits with a really blurry background. They call it bokeh, okay? The bokeh in the background now is a little misconception about what bokeh is, but we're going to talk about that right now. There's depth of field and then there's bokeh. But you've seen the photographs with really soft, blurry backgrounds that have a really nice bokeh effect. That is done with low apertures. That's done with apertures like 1.4, f2, 2.8, and they stand back and zoom in, which is in this pandemic. Okay, so you stand back and you zoom in, and for one, it gives you that social distancing, but also it gives you a flattened space in 2 dimensions and at low apertures. And if you create a lot of depth behind, so you basically take your subject, put the background really far behind them, use a low aperture, then stand back away from them and zoom way in. So you got so much depth behind them, and you're zooming way in, and you've got a low aperture, so that everything behind them is just going to be a blur. And if you focus right, it's going to be a perfect focus right on their eyeball, which is going to give you that portrait that I'm talking about, that type of effect. Okay. So use low apertures to get a great depth of field. Now, depth of field, we're talking about the amount of blur that starts in a radial fashion, because remember your lens is round, okay? So depth of field is where does the blur start in a radial fashion around your lens from your focal point, okay? So you got to understand that you have a focal point. When you focus on something specific, that is always going to be sharp. It doesn't matter what aperture you're at. If you're at 1.4, you're at f16, as long as you are using a fast enough shutter speed and you hit your exposure accurate, or your focus accurately, you will always have a sharp focal point. Now, what depth of field refers to is the amount of blur that starts in a radial fashion away from your focal point, okay? So if you focus on somebody's eyeball at 1.8 or 1.4, there's a good chance that their other eyeball isn't in focus because you have a very shallow depth of field, okay? The actual focal plane that's sharp, the actual horizontal focal plane, the area in space, out in space, the area in space that's wide enough to have a focal area, that's going to be thinner at a wider aperture, okay? So the higher your aperture, 8, 11, 16, the less depth of field you're going to have, so the more sharpness you're going to have away from the focal point. So you can go either direction with it depending on what your desired results are, okay? Say I'm photographing a landscape, and it's super far off in the distance, and there's rolling hills for miles, okay? Well, I might want to shoot at f11 because I want to get more of the distance in focus, okay? I want more of the distance sharp away from where I actually selectively focus on my image, okay? Okay, so portraits for low apertures, I mean, that's pretty much a given, but you got to be careful of going too low. But you got to imagine that when you're actually indoors, depending what kind of light sources you're using, if you have any, or if you're using window light, you're going to be at a wide aperture, but you just make sure your focus, okay, so let's talk about focusing for a second when it comes down to apertures, okay? So we call these fast lenses, these really wide aperture lenses. This is a 1.8 lens. We call this a fast lens. And we call it fast for a couple of reasons, okay? The main reason why we call it fast is because you can shoot at fast shutter speeds with it because it opens up really wide to allow in more light. What a lot of people don't realize is with fast lenses, you actually focus faster, okay? Let me make that analogy for everybody, okay? So I want you to imagine that, at 1.4, you're in a dark room and the door's not even open yet, okay? So let's say you're in a dark room and the door's not even open yet. And so that means your aperture is completely closed, okay? Let's say you open the door just a little bit, okay? And let's just say you're in a dark room and you dropped a needle, okay? And your aperture is at f16. So the door is just slightly open. It's just allowing in a little bit of light. How hard is it going to be to find that needle? Okay. Now imagine that you're at 1.4, so now your door is all the way open in the room, so there's all kinds of light being allowed in at 1.4, the door's all the way open. Now it's really easy to find that needle. It's really easy to find that focus. You see what I'm saying? So fast lenses also interprets the faster focus. So, you know, fast lenses are beneficial, but they're very expensive, okay? When you get a lens that is at like 2.8, that's like, let's just use the 70 to 200, 2.8 for example. That's a really common lens, really common portrait lens. That lens is 2.8 all the way through, okay? So from 70 millimeter to 200 millimeter zoom, you can be at 2.8 all the way through. Now look at my scale here on my screen. You'll notice the 2.8 there is still really wide open. That still has a lot of light gathering capability, okay? So to have a lens that can magnify as well, magnify from 70 millimeter to 200 millimeter as well as be at 2.8 the entire time, that's why those lenses cost like $2,000 or $1,700, is because of the amount of optics and layers of glass that lens takes in order to be able to magnify at 2.8 all the way through its zoom range, okay? So you will find that low aperture lenses that are fixed lenses are actually a little bit less expensive than the zoom lenses that are low apertures, okay? So let's talk about like what sports photographers use, okay? Those guys, they've got like some of those lenses that Nikkor and Canon make for sports photography, like they're like 2.8, 600 millimeter lenses. They don't even make those lenses until you order them because the optics are so massively huge that you need a heavy duty tripod just to hold the lens itself, okay? Some of you guys in the group probably have that experience where you're using a monopod and you actually mount your big lens 70 to 200 or something like that to your monopod, and that gives you better balance with wildlife photography and stuff like that. So talking about the scale, okay, so again, remember yesterday, we talked about the ISO scale, and every time you duplicate your ISO number, you're getting one more stop of light, okay? So every time you increase your ISO, you're getting a brighter image, okay? Well, the brighter scale for aperture goes the other way. Remember, it's the pupil of your eye, okay? So the wider the pupil of your eye, the brighter it is, okay? Because it's allowing more light in, all right? So you can see at f16, you're darker because it's more constricted. You're not allowing in as much light. And then as you go down the scale, you're going to get wider and wider with your aperture, which is going to give you a brighter image. Okay, so again, compared to the pupil of your eye. That is the most important thing to understand with aperture. And just like with the ISO scale, every time you hit this mark, every time you go from 1.4 to 2, 1.4 to 2 is one stop darker. 2 to 2.8 is one stop darker. 2.8 to 4 is one stop darker. 4 to 5.6 is one stop darker. And it's darker because the aperture blades are getting more constricted. It's darker because your pupils are getting more constricted, okay? And then going the other way with that, if you go from f8 to f4, if you count that out, f8, 1, 2, that's 2 stops brighter. Because remember, your aperture is getting wider. Remember, it's counterintuitive. So the lower your f-stop, the brighter. You got to remember that. The bigger the number doesn't mean better. In fact, there's really no better in the exposure triangle. There's just balance, okay? There's no better, there's just balance. You have to be able to balance this exposure triangle when you're out in the field. So what's the best settings? What's the best this? What's the best? There isn't, okay? You have to balance out this system, okay? And balancing out isn't as daunting as you think it is once you start to realize where the counterintuitive nature of what the exposure triangle is. Because remember, your ISO is in pure darkness, so you're responding to light. If you were actually light itself, you wouldn't be capturing yourself like this, if that makes any sense. You have to capture light. In order to capture light, you have to follow this science, and the beginning of capturing light is allowing light into your camera, and you allow light into your camera with your aperture, which is, again, right here. It's at the front of your lens, right there, okay? So remember, you got to relate the pupil of your eye to your aperture, and that's the most important thing to understand. And then understand that the higher the number, the darker the image, and then the lower the number, the brighter the image. And then you count the stops from there. Okay. Break up your exposure triangle into stops of light. Every time you hit one of these marks, it's either +1 or -1. It's as simple as that. So anyway, I got a couple more things I want to cover for everybody today. But we put together a little behind the scenes video that I plan to show everybody here at the end. So make sure you stay tuned for that because it's hilarious. Just bloopers, outtakes of me on camera like this, but stumbling over my words or swearing or whatever. Got the Zelda music playing in the back. All right, just like ISO and just like aperture and just like shutter speed is your exposure value is always going to be calculated by what type of light is your subject in. Okay, that's the most important thing that everybody needs to understand because you have to be able to look at the light that you're in and then the light that your subject is in and decide whether or not you're in the same type of light or if they're standing in a completely different type of lighting situation. Now, here's a scenario that will happen oftentimes that can be very frustrating for portrait photographers. Is partly cloudy days. Okay, so partly cloudy days, you've got a mix of overcast, and it's always changing. It's always changing. You got a mix of overcast, you've got a mix of direct sunlight, you've got reflective off the clouds, you've got all kinds of light in all different directions, and it's always moving. So it's kind of like a target in motion that you're trying to capture. This can actually be a lot of fun, but you have to be able to. You have to look at where you're. You can't just like take this and say this is the end all to exposure. Okay, you have to be able to see the light differently because when you're balancing your exposure meter, it's so sensitive. If you want that deep, rich color that you see a lot of photographers get, you have to be able to master this. Okay, you have to be able to make sure like. You can't be okay with a 33% miss. And remember, a 33% miss is 1/3 of one stop. Okay, remember, if you go from 2 to 2.8, that's one stop. Okay, if you miss an exposure by one stop, that's actually a significant miss. Okay, 1/3 of a stop is even a significant miss. So you'll notice, I don't have my handheld light meter near me right now, but with my handheld light meter, they actually break it down into 1/10 increments to make sure that you are very accurate. Back on the film days, we would shoot positive film, and I still do sometimes. But with positive film is that way where you can't miss your exposure at all because there's no latitude to bring back the shadows and there's no latitude to bring back the highlights. And when you hit your exposure value accurately, you get this extremely rich color. So with that said, we've been talking about bright and dark, and we're always talking about bright and dark with photography. It's always a balance. And you look at the scale. It just one side's brighter, one side's darker for each one. ISO, aperture, shutter speed. Tomorrow we'll be talking about shutter speed. Today we're talking about aperture. Yeah, if you hadn't checked out the lesson on ISO yesterday, make sure you do that. Then check out this lesson too, because we're scratching the surface of these, but I'm also giving you information that is pretty good information for the amount of time allotted. I got 26 minutes into this, and I've already got a pretty good explanation of aperture in there. I don't want you to be confused by the numbers, other than just remember that the lower the f-stop number, the smaller the number, the brighter. So the larger the number, the darker. Okay, remember, darker and brighter, those aren't synonymous with good and bad. Okay. There isn't good or bad. It's brighter or darker, and you have to balance it out. You take a photo, it's too dark, you have to brighten it up, and vice versa, okay? But you don't just brighten it up and say it looks good based on the back of your screen. You got to be able to interpret how the back of your screen looks and know what a good exposure value looks like, okay? We'll be talking about exposure value meters, too, and we'll be doing that another time. But remember, it's a balance. You don't just get close and say you're good. Like a professional photographer, you need to be precise. And that's what I pride myself on, is being extremely precise and shooting at an extremely low frame count, okay? Being precise, shooting at a low frame, it's like similar to like a marksman in the military. How many shots do you need and how balanced can you be, okay? I don't need 50 shots of the same thing. I just need 2 or 3 with a couple good expressions. And if you build your pose accordingly, if you build your pose of your portrait subject accordingly, you build their feet, You build their knees, you build their hips, you build their shoulders. You get them moving a little bit, you tell them a joke, snap, snap, snap. That's all you need. You didn't need to make them uncomfortable with all those frames of them when they didn't feel like they were looking great, okay? We're going to be talking about more about posing on another time, so just be on the lookout for that. We're getting there. I want to show you guys everything. I want to show you something really special coming up here. So we just know we got posing coming up soon. Tomorrow we're going to be doing shutter speed. And then with that said, we're going to roll right into what is going to be one of the coolest sections. I want everyone to pay attention to this because this is what everybody in our course gets to see. This is in our Frame Your Future course. This is behind the scenes of us actually making the course. My brother and I, we made this course over the entire course of 2020, and we put together a behind the scenes footage. So go ahead and enjoy, and hopefully you guys like that lesson on Aperture, and make sure you check out our website, certifiedphototraining.com/register.
June 28th.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Deep into this.
1, 2, 3. Sure, you mark your calendars for June 28th. It's a Saturday. It'll be our live coaching.
I think it's a Sunday.
Well, I this way I like it more. Thanks again for
Thanks again for joining me.
in my private and for joining my private student group here. You're going to get private access and coaching directly from me. So there we go. That one is focused on the tree. Now here, what you can do with AFS is actually move. I'm still in the same composition, but I can actually move my dot over here and now focus out of there. Faster. All right, that's good. Nice focus. Good, good, good. All right. So what I was doing there was I was tracking him. The entire time he was riding by, I was actually panning with him, trying to keep my focus on the top of his face or somewhere near the top of his body to try to get his face in focus. Now we're going to do it again because with autofocus continuous, you're going to get mixed results and you're going to want to photograph it a few times to make sure that you get everything sharp. Now I'm at 1/250th of a second. That should be fast enough for how fast he's riding. If he was riding any faster than that, I might want to bump my shutter speed up to 1/500th. Okay? Wow, it's hot out here. All right, I want you to ride by me like right along the line here. All right, now I'm gonna try to get a really creative shot. This is with natural motion blur. This is a very difficult shot to get. All right, let's go. Okay, let's do it again. And I want you to get closer to me. Yeah, come out here. Because this is about right where I'm going to shoot it, perpendicular. And definitely look over at me, but ride slow. You can ride slow. Because I'm going to try to hit that focus point on your face the whole time. God, it's a tough shot to get. So it's a tough shot to get. Let's try it again. This is no longer about the video, it's just me doing it. And if I can get it, the better. If I had a longer lens, it'd be easier. Ooh, that might have been it. So we're working on the video for everybody here about the do's and don'ts of what to do in certain lighting conditions. What I'm doing right now is photographing a don't. As you have seen in the video, the don't is do not place your subject facing the sun. It's a big no-no. They squint, they look terrible, they sweat, they're not comfortable. A million things wrong with it. I do is point the tip, the Lumisphere ball of my light meter towards the sun, towards the lens, okay? That's giving me a meter, a reading of 100 ISO at f8 at 500th of a second. So that's all I have to do is plug those into my camera. Okay. And now what I'm doing is I'm focusing on Dan's face, if I can focus. Oh, I'm on live view, that's why. And make sure your camera is not on live view. There we go. Great. He looks terrible. That's fantastic. We just had Dan in direct sunlight, as you just seen. What I did here, this is what you're going to want to do when you're doing a portrait in direct sunlight like this, is you're going to want to put their back to the sun. And in fact, this would be more so like that. Now you'll see. So as you see here, we're talking about different lighting situations. Here is an ideal lighting situation. We have Dan in overcast weather. It's nice and comfortable out here. I'm not sweating too hard. If you look directly at Dan here, you're in scattered light. As soon as the light came out, back up. So we've been talking about what to do in direct sunlight. I showed you what not to do. I showed you what you can do in an actual set that has direct sunlight on it. The best practice to do during direct sunlight is to actually place your subject in the shade, find a shady area, place your subject there. You'll see here Dan is now nice, evenly lit. He doesn't have those rings around his eyes. He's nice and evenly lit all the way across his face. This is the type of photograph you're looking for. You want their face nice and evenly lit. This is the juice right here, dude. Yeah, right. Okay. Let's wait for the sun to come back out. Dude, so look at these photos. Come here. God, dude, this is the best representation. What not to do, what to do first, what to do second.
Oh, that's with the flash?
Yeah.
So you metered for the first one? And
I metered for the, yeah, I use the same light meter reading, yeah. Source or reflector, some sort of lighting that will fill in that shadow. And what I have on my camera here is a pop-up flash, and that should do just fine.
Sorry.
You're good. And all I have to do is pop up my flash. We're in an overcast light right now, so the sun is actually behind the clouds behind me here. And what this does is it actually creates a nice, even, diffused light all the way across wherever you're at. And what that does is it actually allows you to, actually not.
say something like that looks like
Is it recording?
Yeah.
All right, we're here now in what would be considered the late evening hours, leading into the sunset, dusk, kind of twilight hour. This is the time of day that's really great because it's extremely directional light. You can see Dan back here. You see how far his shadow is falling there? This is prime lighting. This is a great lighting situation. When you show up to your portrait shoot, you want to be ready by this time, okay? Because guess what? In a few moments, this is going to be even better lighting. It continues to get better until it gets dark.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're going to want to wait for the cars to actually be coming by. So when you have a lapse in the cars, you're going to want to hold off for a little bit. If you're using your self-timer, that's something I recommend to do. Put your self-timer on like 2 or 3 seconds. That way you don't have any motion shake after you press the button and like maybe bump the tripod a little bit. So you'll want to take that into consideration when you're doing these long exposures. You might want to be ahead of the cars a little bit in order to get the photo to actually shoot at the right time. So let's dial that in. I am on 100 ISO. I'm going to go to f16. I'm going to go to 15 seconds. So this is my self-timer button. It will look very similar on your camera wherever it may be. And I want to compose my frame nice, plan my trails. And I'm focusing right on the end of that light pole. So in short, everybody, if you can help it, try to schedule your shoots or try to shoot your portraits during an overcast day. What that does is it just really evens out all the light, makes everything flat and even, and you don't have any harsh shadows, you don't have any bright highlights, everything's lit nice and evenly. And what you can do then, it might look kind of gray to you, but what you can do with your white balance, and we'll be talking about in the next module. And you'll be able to do that with your white balance in Lightroom. We'll be talking about that in the next lesson, in the next module.
Try that again, you fucking maniac.
Dude, it's not fucking easy, man.
Start from
I'm talking to a phone.
Start from warming up.
Why don't I just do it all over again? All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that behind the scenes footage there. There's a lot to have been learned there. So if you were paying close attention, if you weren't, go ahead, rewind the footage and go look at that scene again, because there's a lot to learn in there if you look behind the bloopers and some of the funny takes that we had out there. With that said, I sincerely appreciate everybody's time, and I look forward to seeing you inside the course. Thank you.